Imagine you have a neighborhood or several blocks. So in a small town, you have youth that hangs around. They hang on the streets. They don't do anything with their lives. And now the population there is fed up with the issue. So they want the municipality to put more police officers on the streets to remove the hanging youth. But then there's this criminologist that tells them, don't do it. This will backfire. You have a sociologist that tells them, don't do it. There is something else going on that you guys don't want to address. That's why you focus so much on those youth on the streets. And then you have an anthropologist who looks at it and says, why is the problem that they're hanging on the streets doing nothing? They're not harming anyone, right? And if they're on the streets and they're doing nothing, then that means that there is something wrong with the community, because if you had a healthy community, they won't even think about doing nothing. So the anthropologist looks at it and says something is terribly wrong with the expectations within this community. A psychologist who looks only at individual cases will look at it and say, I think this will not be a good idea. Don't do it. The public administrator, who's mainly focused on numbers and data, may say, do it, because they don't look at the human impact over a long period of time. So why am I giving you this example? Because often we go for counsel to people who are not fit to give us any counsel. We go to friends, relatives, or people at church. We go to people within our comfort zone, as it's called in the world. There is no such thing as a comfort zone in reality, but it's something we imagine, that we have a sphere of comfort. Because those are the people you're familiar with. But when you think about it carefully, if the people you are familiar with, if they have no knowledge concerning the field where you need to be counseled in, then why are you going to them to get counsel for an area that they're not familiar with? Look, if I have pain in a tooth, I go to a dentist, right? Because the dentist is specialized in oral health and oral well-being. If I have a flat tire or my car breaks down, I go to a car mechanic, because that is his field of specialization. So, when it comes to life's issues, spiritual issues, where do you go? You go to people who are not only familiar, but they're knowledgeable and wise in that field. Right? So, why am I saying this? Because I want you to think for a moment. How often does it happen that I say we because believers do it also. How often does it happen that believers cling onto the counsel of the ungodly? And with ungodly, that's everyone that's not renewed in their mind, everyone that doesn't walk with Christ. How often do we hold on to the counsel of the ungodly? For the mere reason that it's familiar. Now, something can be familiar to you. There's nothing wrong with that. But just because something is familiar doesn't mean it's practical. You can be familiar with the streets, with the toxic culture of the streets. But does it mean that it's a good thing that you're familiar with it? Does it mean that you should condone that toxic street culture? No. So just because you're familiar with something doesn't mean it's okay, doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's honorable, doesn't mean it should be condoned. About that example of having youth hanging on the streets and people becoming fed up with it, and now they just want to be relieved from the issue. There was a case like that in the Netherlands where a criminologist told the authorities, don't do it. I forgot which news article it was. It was a while back. It had to do with Moroccan youth that, according to the locals, were causing annoyance. And I'm not going into the arguments that the criminologist gave, Because it comes down to the following. It's very simple. When a community is upset with something, I'm not talking about an individual, I'm talking about the community. When a community is upset with something, 9 out of 10 times, it's only to cover up something else they don't want to face. Think about it. If you have 30 youngsters between 12 years old and 20 years old, they're hanging on the streets, just 30 of them, in a community where, let me say, 8,000 people live. So from 8,000 people, only 30 hang on the street. They may sell drugs, maybe properly, or they may steal bikes from time to time, but it's just 30 in a population of 8,000. I'm not saying that that situation is okay. I'm not saying that. But are you going to tell me that those 8,000 people are all upset because 30 are hanging on the streets? They have no army. They don't even have much finance to begin with. That's why they're on the streets. So you have 30 losers that hang around malls from time to time to do something criminal just to get some high or to go to some party. That's a manifestation, that's a symptom that something is wrong with that community. Because if the community was healthy and functional, nobody would end up like that. So you have a mini tiny symptom that manifests in a community that reveals the toxicity of that community. And now everyone becomes upset with it, saying, oh, those youth on the streets, oh, why don't they get a job? Why don't they do this? Everyone's so upset with those 30 that are on the streets. But in the media, it appears as if there are 200 on the streets. They don't say that they're 200, but they exaggerate it. So everyone is so focused now on those guys on the streets. Meanwhile, there are children being abducted in that community. Meanwhile, there's a lot of domestic violence. Meanwhile, there are people dying of illnesses because the health insurance of that place is not correct. There are many other things happening in that community that requires the attention of the population, but people rather talk about those 30 guys that hang on the streets. Does that add up to you? Does it add up to you that they prefer to talk about 30 youth hanging on the streets above the hundreds in the community that are endangered? It doesn't add up, does it? So if you put effort in removing the 30 on the streets, what happens now? The distraction is gone. But now that the population has no distraction anymore, now all the tensions, all the conflicts that should have been addressed will now become visible. And once all the conflicts, all the tensions become visible, there will be people losing because of it. And when someone has nothing left to lose, they lose it. So now you will have people exploding, committing suicide, or they kill other people, then commit suicide. You'll have all this weird escalation in the community. Why? Because the distraction is removed. Now, I'm not approving the distraction. Neither am I approving that the population is using the distraction to keep things calm. In the world, however, where they don't follow Christ, where they don't walk by faith, they need to find a way to manage conflict in the community. And one way they manage conflict is by highlighting one of the symptoms that show that something's wrong with the community. They highlight the symptoms so that people think that the symptom is a problem that stands on its own. Why? By doing this, they don't have to look within. They don't have to look around them to see what's really going on. So, it comes down to the community having a vested interest in keeping those 30 men Now later those 30 men will become older, so there will be other youth hanging on streets. They have a vested interest in keeping disadvantaged young people on the streets. They don't want to give them jobs. They don't want to integrate them. They want them to remain impoverished and on the streets. The community has a vested interest in it, because without the common population having those youth on the streets looked down upon, they won't feel relieved being part of society. And when they can't feel relieved anymore because they're part of society, they begin to see through that they are stuck, that they need this paper or this cotton, symbol of cotton that we call money, that they need it in order to exchange it for resources to remain alive. And that they are programmed to give their bodily and mental energy to get a piece of paper. Most have to do it on a full-time basis, and they never get ahead. This is not, that is not something praiseworthy. That's not something that anyone should aspire to. So nobody in their right mind would take such an existence, would tolerate it. But because now they have those youth on the streets they can look down on and compare themselves with, now they feel at ease. So now society will continue and people don't notice that they are trapped. It can be that someone is married to a woman he doesn't want to be with anymore, but because he has the validation of being a married man, of being a respected and validated figure in that society, because of that, he remains with his wife and he's doing the best he can for his children. But that motivation is not based on natural affection, it's based on the validation he receives from society. The moment he can't get this validation that he's a part of society anymore, he will not see any need anymore for him to remain with his wife and his children. He will likely take off. Or if he can't take off, he'll take it out on his wife and his children. So, if this man is provided the second benefit that he's part of society, he is at ease and the community is left alone. The community will not have to deal with this toxicity. So, worldly people, they crave this narcissistic relief of being part of society. And to maintain this narcissistic relief, the leaders of the world cannot deal with all the problems in society. Because the moment they do, the moment they solve everything, the moment they deal with everything and there is no issue left anymore, people will begin to see through stuff. And once they see through stuff, they won't feel motivated anymore to comply with society. And because they're not motivated anymore, they also don't have any reason, at least in their mind, to not be violent, to not lash out. It can be that you have two relatives that can't stand each other, but the only reason they don't pick up knives and stab one another is because, hey, you're part of society. You go to job every day. You're a contributor. They get praised for being part of the system. And that's what they have. The moment they lose that validation and they're frustrated, they explode. So, when it comes to vested interests, look at what a community wants to avoid. There is no social problem out there without vested interest. Every social problem or every social tension out there has vested interest. People may not be open about the vested interest, of course, because a vested interest is a hidden interest, but that interest is there. So just look at what people want to avoid. And once you understand what they want to avoid, you'll understand what the vested interests are. And as a believer, learn to identify vested interests as soon as possible, so that you will not be trapped by those that maintain those vested interests. Because if a believer is not alert, they'll be tricked into enabling the dysfunction and the defect to preserve the vested interest of those that want to avoid stuff. So you have people that want to avoid things. They are fleeing, and they want others to enable their fleeing. They especially want believers to enable their fleeing. And it's their fleeing that causes all the defects and dysfunctions in a community. So if a believer is not aware nor alert, he or she can be tricked into enabling the dysfunctions and defects of a community. And that should not happen. So a believer, always check what people are avoiding. Look at the bigger picture. Don't only look at the small picture. Don't only look at what's in front of you. Look around. You'll notice things. Well, that's it for now. Keep agreeing with Christ and be at peace.